All right, so if we take all the pieces of data that were supplied to us in the Bookshop dataset and we put them together, we get a data structure that looks like this. So notice that almost all of the connections between these different data sheets were detected automatically by Tableau. Every time we see a noodle, that was a connection that was automatically detected. And a column here is the same thing as the column here, and Tableau did that on its own. There were just a couple things that we had to do manually. Namely, we had to make a union for sales, and we had to make a join, an inner join for booking info. Other than that, Tableau did everything. And this is great. I mean, it really does kind of speed up the process from getting kind of like a raw data source, raw, you know, it's like pretty well cleaned up, but like in many different sheets, kind of spread out data source into a more coherent data source that we can start to analyze. So take a second, pause the video, and complete this as you see it, because we're going to start using these different pieces as we continue our exploration into visualization. So take a second, pause, and complete it. All right, so we're back. So what do we do here? So let's start by answering some questions. So let's go over here to sheet, and notice that in the sheet we have a couple things. We have a number of different fields that we can change. The size, the color, we can insert text or have text based on a field. We have what should be our columns and what should be our rows, and then we have where all of this stuff is displayed. So we call these our shelves. Each one of them is a shelf. We call them our shelves together. So you can drag this thing or that thing onto a shelf. And basically all of this is trying to answer the big question, how do we use space? That's it. Like we have a precious commodity here, and that is space in a visualization. And we want to make sure that that space is used effectively and efficiently. How can we pack as much meaningful data into the space as we can without overwhelming the user or including things that we don't need? This is like a big question, a question that people will dedicate many years of their lives to answering effectively. So we're going to kind of layer this in, right? And in particular, not only do we have these big questions about visualization and how to best visualize data, like the big overarching questions, we have the smaller questions of how do we actually deal with Tableau in particular. So let's start with the Tableau side and build some very simple visualizations that just have to do with one sheet. Okay, so just to get our feet under us. So let's start with just the author. Notice that in the author like sheet here, we have a number of different attributes, as you would expect. These are just the columns of the author data sheet. Notice that they're blue and green. So blue are dimensions and green are measures. So what's the difference here? A dimension is, you can think of it as a categorical variable. In a lot of cases, this is like for instance, a country, a name, a date, a brand. These types of normally categorical variables. Although you might be saying like, Nathan, that's not quite right, because for instance, like birth date, a date you might think of as numerical. Completely. So it's not a perfect overlap between dimensions and measures and categorical and numerical variables. But you'll notice, for instance, in the measures, things like hours writing per day and the count of rows, these are actually like denoted by a number sign. So it's fairly clear that at least in this case, they mean for measures to be thought of as numeric variables. And in fact, they are. So let's actually just say, what author spends the most hours writing per day? So this is a big part of the analytics or the visualization lifecycle, is starting with a question. You have to start with a question to figure out what the appropriate visualization is. So who writes the most, and how do authors, like, what does that distribution of writing time look like? So let's take so we got to get hours writing per day in. So let's do this as rows. There's so many design decisions here. So notice right now, this is just, notice what's happened. This is the sum of the hours writing per day. So Tableau has just taken, for every author, they have an hours writing per day, and it has just summed them up. And we'll talk more about aggregation in a lot of future videos, but it's just summed all of those up because we haven't told it any particular way to break it down. And so let's take last name, for instance, and split it into columns. So now it's saying, okay, each column is the last name of an author, and here they're oriented alphabetically from A to Y in this particular case. And for each person, we have the hours per day that they've written. And so now we get into details about what's the best way to visualize this data set, and that will depend on your question. So we have the data here, right? This is now the time when we have some kind of more detailed decision. So for instance, our question was, who writes the most and what does that distribution look like. And so right now we're actually sorting by something that's not that useful. This is just alphabetically, but it makes it kind of tough sometimes to see who's writing more than who. I don't know. It's not ideal. So what we can do is actually sort this. So this is actually pretty easy. If you hover over hours writing per day and just click this, it automatically sorts it. And now this dimension is actually being used more effectively, because who cares if this person's name is Alice and this person's name is Bob? In this particular case, all we care about is whether Alice or Bob, regardless of who comes first alphabetically, is writing more than the other one. And so now that we've sorted, you can actually kind of see, okay, there are some people that write quite a bit, then there's a kind of a drop off, and then there's kind of like gradual decline. I wouldn't say it's super fast, kind of more like this S-shaped curve. And then there are all the way down to people that don't write, they write, I guess, less than an hour a day or are not currently writing. But again, we have a lot of choices here about what to do as far as details of how we orient these various fields. So we might also say like country of residence is into color. Now I'm going to make an argument that this is perhaps not useful. This is not a good addition because it doesn't help us answer our question. Like if our question is who writes the most, that question is answered without this country of residence. Country of residence in this case is just distracting us from the overall message. So this is to say that adding data into a visualization is not necessarily always a good thing. The only time visualization is really made better by the addition of data is in the cases where that data or those data are directly related to the question at hand. And in this case, they are not. So I would say this is actually a bad addition and we need to take it out. One last thing, notice the sum is still here, but what does it mean now? So when I said earlier it was summing over all authors. So now it's actually summing over just this one author. And so it's still being aggregated, but it's split out by author. And so it's just summing over the individual author and their particular writing time. This becomes important because right now, and we've done this intentionally, is everything is related to just this sheet. And so the aggregation is really simple, but as we start tying sheets together in ever more complicated ways into single visualization, we have to be really, really careful about the level of detail we're operating at and how this aggregation is working. So we'll see cases coming up where that works well, and we'll see cases coming up where that doesn't work so well. And keeping in mind kind of what level of detail we're operating at and what aggregation is happening by default in Tableau is going to be really, really important.